The mess hall at Camp Pendleton buzzed with the usual evening chatter of Marines finishing their dinner. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez sat with his squad, still riding the high from completing their advanced combat training exercise earlier that day. They had dominated every challenge, from urban warfare simulations to night reconnaissance missions. Marcus felt invincible, surrounded by his brothers-in-arms who looked up to him as their leader. "Did you see how we smoked those Navy guys in the obstacle course?" Private Johnson laughed, stabbing at his mashed potatoes. 23 minutes flat. "I bet those SEAL wannabes couldn't even break 30. Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with pride. At 28, he had already earned 3 commendations and was being considered for promotion to gunnery sergeant. His reputation as one of the toughest Marines on base was well established. He had grown up in East Los Angeles, where respect was earned through strength and never backing down from a fight. The Corps had given him direction, but the streets had taught him to never show weakness. Speaking of Navy, Corporal Williams pointed toward the entrance. "Check out the fresh meat." Marcus turned to see a small group entering the mess hall. They wore standard Navy fatigues, but something about their bearing suggested they were different from the typical sailors who occasionally rotated through the base. Leading the group was a woman who couldn't have been more than 5'4", with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She moved with quiet confidence, her green eyes scanning the room as she guided her team toward an empty table. "Look at that," Johnson whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Navy's really scraping the bottom of the barrel these days. Sending little girls to do men's work." The comment triggered laughter around the table, but Marcus found himself studying the woman more carefully. There was something about her posture, the way she carried herself, that didn't match the dismissive assumptions his men were making. Still, the ingrained rivalry between Marines and Navy ran deep, and he wasn't about to let his squad think he was going soft. As the evening progressed, Marcus noticed the Navy group keeping to themselves. The woman seemed to be in charge, occasionally leaning over to speak quietly with her teammates. They ate efficiently, without the boisterous conversation that characterized most military meals. Their discipline was evident, but Marcus attributed it to typical Navy stuffiness rather than anything particularly impressive. The incident began innocently enough. Marcus was returning from the serving line with a second helping of dessert when he had to navigate around the Navy table. The woman was standing, reaching across to collect empty trays, when Marcus bumped into her chair. It was a minor collision, barely enough to jostle the furniture, but it caused her carefully arranged hair to shift slightly. Without thinking, Marcus reached out and gave her ponytail a playful tug, the kind of gesture that might pass for flirtation in a civilian bar but was completely inappropriate in this setting. "Careful there, sailor," he said with a smirk, expecting the kind of nervous laugh or blush he might get from intimidating a junior service member. The reaction was not what he expected. The woman turned slowly, her green eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. There was no fear, no embarrassment, no uncertainty. Instead, he saw something that made his stomach clench with sudden unease. Her gaze was the look of someone who had seen combat, who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure, who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. "Excuse me?" Her voice was quiet but carried easily across the suddenly hushed dining area. Other conversations died as nearby service members sensed the tension building. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. His squad was watching, expecting him to maintain his dominant position. Other Marines had noticed the confrontation and were waiting to see how their respected staff sergeant would handle this Navy upstart. The pressure to maintain his reputation warred with a growing sense that he had made a serious mistake. "Just being friendly," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Maybe you Navy folks could use some lessons in situational awareness." The woman's teammates had stopped eating. Marcus noticed they weren't rushing to defend her, which he initially interpreted as cowardice or abandonment. What he failed to recognize was that their calm confidence suggested they knew she could handle herself without assistance. "I see," the woman replied, her tone remaining level. "And you are?" "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps," he answered automatically, straightening to his full 6-foot height. The formal introduction was meant to remind her of the rank and service branch distinction, to re-establish the hierarchy he felt slipping away. "Thank you for the introduction, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, emphasizing his rank with perfect military courtesy while somehow making it sound less impressive than usual. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, and these are members of my team." The title hit Marcus like a physical blow. Lieutenant Commander was equivalent to Major in the Marine Corps, significantly outranking his Staff Sergeant position. But more troubling was the implication of her having a team rather than a unit or squad. In Navy terminology, that usually meant something specialized. "What kind of team?" he asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "SEAL Team 7, she replied simply. The mess hall fell into complete silence. Even the kitchen staff seemed to pause their work as the significance of her words spread through the room. Navy SEALs were legendary even among elite Marines, representing the pinnacle of special operations capability. But, more shocking than her unit affiliation was the revelation that she was their leader. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about the situation was wrong. The small woman he had just treated with casual disrespect was not only a superior officer but one of the most elite warriors in the entire military. Her calm response to his inappropriate behavior now made perfect sense. She had faced down enemies in combat situations where her life depended on maintaining control. "I apologize, ma'am," he managed, but the words felt inadequate given the magnitude of his error. "Apology noted, Staff Sergeant," Lieutenant Commander Chen replied. "Though I suspect this situation calls for more than words." Around the mess hall, Marines and Navy personnel watched the drama unfold. Marcus could feel his reputation crumbling in real time. The squad that had looked up to him minutes earlier now saw him as someone who had embarrassed not just himself but their entire unit. The casual arrogance that had served him well in previous situations now seemed like foolish bravado. Lieutenant Commander Chen stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Marcus could hear. "I understand that Marines and Navy have a long-standing rivalry, Staff Sergeant. That's healthy competition. But what just happened crossed a line from professional rivalry into personal disrespect. In my world, actions have consequences." Marcus wanted to defend himself, to explain that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment rather than deliberate malice. But, looking into her steady gaze, he realized that his intentions mattered less than the impact of his actions. He had judged her based on appearance and gender rather than capability and position. Worse, he had done so publicly, undermining her authority in front of both their service members. "What kind of consequences?" he asked quietly. A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "The kind that help people learn important lessons about respect and assumptions, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I believe in education through experience." With that cryptic statement, she returned to her table, gathered her team, and left the mess hall. The normal din of conversation slowly resumed, but Marcus remained standing where she had left him, acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments surrounding him. His squad approached cautiously, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. Their confident leader had just been thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone they had initially dismissed as insignificant. The hierarchy they understood, where physical size and aggressive posture determined dominance, had proven inadequate when confronted with genuine authority backed by extraordinary competence. "Sarge," Private Johnson said hesitantly, "what do you think she meant about consequences?" Marcus shook his head, still trying to process the encounter. "I don't know, Johnson. But something tells me we're about to find out." That night, lying in his bunk, Marcus replayed the confrontation over and over. He had built his military career on being the toughest person in the room, on never backing down from a challenge. But Lieutenant Commander Chen had challenged him in a way he wasn't prepared for. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or make threats. Her quiet confidence and moral authority had been more effective than any display of aggression. For the first time in years, Marcus questioned whether his approach to leadership was as effective as he had believed. The woman he had casually dismissed had achieved a level of military excellence that few people ever reached. She commanded some of the most elite warriors in the world, individuals who trusted her with their lives in the most dangerous situations imaginable. As he drifted toward sleep, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Lieutenant Commander Chen was far from over. Her words about education through experience suggested she had something specific in mind, and he had a growing suspicion that whatever she was planning would challenge everything he thought he knew about strength, leadership, and respect. The next morning would bring new revelations about the SEAL team's presence at Camp Pendleton, and Marcus would discover that his actions in the mess hall had set in motion events that would forever change his understanding of what it meant to be a true warrior. But, for now, he lay in the darkness, wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that he had seriously underestimated someone who could have been a valuable ally, and, instead had made himself a target for lessons he wasn't sure he was ready to learn. Dawn came too early for Marcus Rodriguez. The wake-up call at 0500 hours felt more jarring than usual, and he found himself moving through his morning routine with uncharacteristic hesitation. The events of the previous evening played on repeat in his mind, each memory bringing fresh waves of embarrassment and uncertainty. During morning formation, Captain Harrison made an announcement that sent ice through Marcus's veins. Today we have the privilege of hosting SEAL Team 7 for a joint training exercise. This is an opportunity for our Marines to learn from some of the most elite warriors in the military. I expect everyone to conduct themselves with the highest level of professionalism. The captain's eyes found Marcus in the formation, holding his gaze just long enough to make the message clear. Word of the mess hall incident had already reached the command level, and Marcus realized his reputation was hanging by a thread thinner than he had imagined. After formation, Marcus was summoned to Captain Harrison's office. The walk across the base felt like a death march, with every Marine he passed seeming to know about his humiliation. The whispered conversations and sideways glances confirmed his worst fears about how quickly news traveled in the close-knit military community. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Captain Harrison began without preamble, "I've received some concerning reports about your conduct last evening." Marcus stood at attention, staring at a point just over his commanding officer's shoulder. "Yes, sir. Would you care to explain what happened in the mess hall with Lieutenant Commander Chen?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Marcus knew that his response would determine not only his immediate future but possibly his entire military career. Any attempt to minimize or excuse his actions would be seen as a lack of accountability, but fully admitting the scope of his error felt like signing his own professional death warrant. "I made an error in judgment, sir," Marcus replied carefully. "I behaved inappropriately toward a superior officer from another service branch." Captain Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the kind of penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless Marines over the years. "An error in judgment. That's one way to put it. Lieutenant Commander Chen has requested that you personally participate in today's training exercise. Specifically, she wants you to assist with a demonstration." The word sent another chill down Marcus's spine. The idea of being singled out by the SEAL commander for special attention felt ominous, especially given their previous encounter. He could imagine himself being used as an example of what not to do, becoming a cautionary tale that would follow him for the rest of his career. "What kind of demonstration, sir?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Combat scenario training. Hand-to-hand combat techniques, tactical decision-making, leadership under pressure. The kind of skills that separate elite operators from ordinary service members." Captain Harrison's tone carried a warning. "This is your opportunity to redeem yourself, Staff Sergeant. I suggest you don't waste it." An hour later, Marcus found himself standing on the training ground with 30 other Marines, facing the SEAL team that had entered the mess hall the night before. In daylight, they looked even more formidable than they had in the dining facility. Each member carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from surviving the most rigorous military training in the world. Lieutenant Commander Chen stood before the assembled Marines, her presence commanding immediate attention without any need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. She wore standard combat fatigues, but her equipment was noticeably different from what the Marines carried. Her gear was lighter, more streamlined, designed for operations where stealth and mobility were more important than overwhelming firepower. "Good morning, Marines," she began, her voice carrying easily across the training area. "Today we're going to explore some fundamental concepts about combat effectiveness, leadership, and the importance of never underestimating your opponent." Her eyes found Marcus in the formation, and he felt exposed under her steady gaze. There was no malice in her expression, but there was also no warmth. She was looking at him with the kind of professional assessment that a doctor might give to a particularly challenging patient.
Combat isn't just about physical strength or aggressive behavior, she continued.
The most dangerous opponents are often those who can think clearly under pressure, who can adapt to changing circumstances, and who understand that true power comes from competence rather than intimidation.
The first exercise was designed to demonstrate tactical thinking under pressure.
The SEAL team set up a scenario where Marines had to navigate through a mock urban environment while accomplishing specific objectives. Marcus watched as his fellow Marines approached the challenge with their typical aggressive tactics, using overwhelming force to solve every problem they encountered. The SEAL team's approach was completely different. They moved like shadows through the same environment, accomplishing their objectives with minimal noise and maximum efficiency. Where the Marines had kicked down doors, the SEALs found unlocked windows. Where the Marines had engaged in prolonged firefights with enemy combatants, the SEALs had neutralized threats before they even knew they were under attack. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Lieutenant Commander Chen called out after the first round of exercises.
"Would you mind assisting with our next demonstration?"
Marcus felt every eye in the formation focus on him as he stepped forward. His mouth was dry, and his hands were slightly trembling despite his efforts to project confidence. He had no idea what she had planned, but he suspected it would be designed to illustrate whatever lesson she was trying to teach. "This exercise focuses on hand-to-hand combat," she explained to the assembled Marines. "Specifically, how technique and leverage can overcome raw physical strength."
"Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you appear to be one of the larger Marines here. Would you be willing to participate in a friendly sparring match?"
The word friendly carried undertones that suggested the match would be anything but. Marcus looked at Lieutenant Commander Chen, noting that she was at least 8 inches shorter than him and probably outweighed by at least 60 pounds. Under normal circumstances, the size difference would make any physical confrontation completely one-sided.
But these weren't normal circumstances.
Marcus was beginning to understand that nothing about his encounter with the SEAL commander was going to follow normal patterns.
Still, he couldn't back down in front of his fellow Marines without completely destroying whatever remained of his reputation.
"Yes, ma'am," he replied, stepping into the designated sparring area. "Excellent," she said, beginning to stretch in preparation for the demonstration.
"The rules are simple. This is a grappling exercise, no strikes. The objective is to achieve a submission hold or pin your opponent for 5 seconds. Standard safety protocols apply."
Marcus nodded, settling into a wrestling stance that had served him well during his high school athletics and Marine Corps training.
He had always relied on his size and strength advantages to overwhelm opponents before they could implement any sophisticated techniques.
Against someone as small as Lieutenant Commander Chen, he expected the match to be over in seconds. What happened next would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. The moment the exercise began, Marcus lunged forward, intending to use his weight advantage to drive her to the ground where he could control the match through superior strength. Instead, he found himself flying through the air in a perfect arc before hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. The assembled Marines erupted in surprised murmurs as their staff sergeant lay on his back, gasping and trying to understand what had just happened.
Lieutenant Commander Chen stood calmly over him, not even breathing heavily from the effort.
"The key principle," she explained to the watching Marines while Marcus struggled to regain his composure, "is redirecting your opponent's energy rather than opposing it directly."
Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's strength became a liability when properly leveraged.
Marcus rolled over and pushed himself back to his feet, his pride stinging worse than his bruised ribs.
The confused looks from his fellow Marines were almost more painful than the physical impact.
He had been completely outmatched by someone they had all dismissed as physically inferior.
"Again?"
Lieutenant Commander Chen asked, her tone suggesting that this was more of a command than a question. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus found himself repeatedly thrown, pinned, and submitted by techniques he couldn't anticipate or counter. Each exchange lasted only seconds, with Lieutenant Commander Chen demonstrating a different principle of advanced combat arts. She moved with fluid precision, always seeming to be exactly where Marcus wasn't expecting her to be.
The worst part wasn't the physical domination, though that was humiliating enough. What truly shook Marcus was the realization that she was holding back. Her movements were controlled, designed to illustrate teaching points rather than inflict maximum damage. She could have seriously injured him at any point during their sparring session, but she chose restraint over revenge. After the final takedown, Marcus lay on his back staring at the sky, completely exhausted and thoroughly defeated. His uniform was covered in dust, his ego was shattered, and his understanding of combat effectiveness had been fundamentally altered. The quiet woman he had dismissed as weak had just demonstrated levels of skill that he couldn't even properly comprehend. "Excellent demonstration, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Lieutenant Commander Chen said, offering him a hand up. "Thank you for helping illustrate these concepts to your fellow Marines." Marcus accepted her help getting to his feet, acutely aware of the shocked silence from the watching Marines. Everything they thought they knew about their tough, uncompromising staff sergeant had been challenged by what they had just witnessed. He had been systematically dismantled by someone who weighed less than most of their field packs. "The lesson here," Lieutenant Commander Chen addressed the formation, "isn't about humiliating anyone or proving superiority. It's about understanding that effectiveness in combat comes from training, technique, and mental preparation rather than physical advantages alone. Every warrior, regardless of size or gender, deserves respect based on their capabilities rather than their appearance." The pointed nature of the lesson wasn't lost on anyone present. Marcus realized that his public education was serving multiple purposes. It was teaching the other Marines about assumptions and prejudice while simultaneously providing him with a deeply personal lesson about humility and respect. As the training session concluded and the Marines began returning to their regular duties, Marcus found himself walking slowly back toward the barracks, his mind reeling from everything he had experienced. His fellow Marines gave him a wide berth, unsure how to interact with someone whose reputation had been so thoroughly dismantled. Private Johnson approached hesitantly. "Sarge, are you okay?" Marcus paused, considering the question more deeply than Johnson probably intended. Was he okay? Physically, he would recover from the bruises and soreness within a few days. Professionally, the damage to his standing would take much longer to repair. But, personally, he was beginning to think that this experience might have been exactly what he needed, even if it wasn't what he had wanted. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be, Johnson," Marcus replied quietly. "Even if it's not where I expected to end up." That evening, as Marcus sat in his quarters writing letters of apology and reflection, he began to understand that Lieutenant Commander Chen's lesson was far from over. The physical demonstration had been just the beginning of his education about leadership, respect, and the difference between authority earned through intimidation and authority earned through competence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that he could learn from his mistakes. But tonight, for the first time in his military career, Marcus Rodriguez was forced to confront the possibility that everything he thought he knew about being a warrior might be incomplete. 3 days after his humbling experience on the training ground, Marcus Rodriguez was still processing the emotional aftermath when an unexpected summons arrived. Lieutenant Commander Chen had requested his presence for what she termed additional professional development. The message came through official channels, leaving him no option but to comply, regardless of his personal feelings about further exposure to her methods of instruction. Marcus found himself standing outside a secured briefing room at 0800 hours, his dress uniform impeccable despite the turmoil in his mind. The past 72 hours had been a blur of whispered conversations, sideways glances, and the uncomfortable sensation of being a living legend for all the wrong reasons. His squad treated him with a mixture of sympathy and confusion, unsure how to reconcile their image of their tough leader with the man they had watched being systematically dismantled by someone half his size. When he knocked and entered the briefing room, Marcus was surprised to find Lieutenant Commander Chen alone, reviewing what appeared to be personnel files spread across a conference table. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Please, have a seat." Marcus remained standing, his military bearing rigid despite his internal uncertainty. "Ma'am, I prefer to stand if that's acceptable." "Actually, it's not," she replied firmly but not unkindly. What we need to discuss requires a conversation between professionals, not a formal military briefing. Sit down, Marcus. The use of his first name was unexpected and, somehow, more unsettling than her previous formal address. It suggested a level of familiarity that he wasn't prepared for, especially given their recent history. Reluctantly, he took the offered seat, maintaining eye contact despite his discomfort. "I've been reviewing your service record," Lieutenant Commander Chen began, sliding a thick folder across the table toward him. "Your file makes for interesting reading." Marcus glanced at the folder but didn't open it. He knew what it contained: commendations for courage under fire during deployments in Afghanistan, fitness reports that consistently rated him among the top Marines in his unit, testimonials from subordinates who respected his leadership under combat conditions. It was a record he had been proud of until recently. 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, consistently outstanding performance evaluations, she continued, reading from his file. Recommendations from superior officers describing you as fearless, decisive, and completely dedicated to your Marines' welfare. This is the record of an exceptional warrior and leader. Marcus waited for the inevitable but that he knew was coming. The praise felt hollow given what she had witnessed of his behavior and character over the past few days. "So I have to ask myself," Lieutenant Commander Chen continued, leaning back in her chair, "how does someone with this level of demonstrated excellence in combat leadership end up behaving like a fraternity boy in a mess hall?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it was so precisely accurate. Marcus had been asking himself the same question since the incident, and he didn't have a satisfactory answer. The disconnect between his professional achievements and his personal behavior was something he had never been forced to confront so directly. "I don't know, ma'am," he admitted quietly. "I've been trying to figure that out myself." "Let me offer a theory," she said, opening another file. "This one's mine, for comparison." Marcus found himself looking at a service record that was even more impressive than his own. Lieutenant Commander Chen had earned her commission through the Naval Academy, graduated top of her class from basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, and had completed multiple combat deployments in some of the most dangerous areas of operation in the Middle East and Africa. Her file contained commendations for actions that were still classified, suggesting involvement in operations that most people would never know about. "The difference between us," she continued, "isn't our dedication to service or our commitment to our people. We've both proven that under fire. The difference is that you've never had to prove yourself to people who assumed you were incapable before you even opened your mouth." Marcus studied her face, beginning to understand where she was leading the conversation. He had always taken for granted that his physical presence commanded immediate respect, that his size and bearing automatically established his credibility as a warrior. The idea that someone might have to earn that same respect through performance alone had never occurred to him. "Every day of my career," Lieutenant Commander Chen continued, "I've had to prove that I belong in rooms where people assumed I was lost, in units where people thought I was a diversity hire, in combat situations where people doubted whether I could keep up with the men around me. I've never had the luxury of coasting on assumptions about my capabilities." "I never thought about it that way," Marcus admitted, though the words felt inadequate to address the scope of what she was describing. "I know you didn't," she replied, and, for the first time since he had met her, her tone carried something approaching gentleness. "And that's not entirely your fault. The military is changing, slowly, but there are still plenty of people who share your assumptions about who belongs in combat roles and who doesn't." She stood and moved to a whiteboard at the front of the room, picking up a marker and beginning to sketch what looked like an organizational chart. "Let me tell you about my team, Marcus. The men and women you saw in the mess hall that night." As she drew, she began describing each member of SEAL Team 7. Petty Officer First Class Williams was a former gang member from Detroit who had turned his life around through military service. Chief Petty Officer Martinez was a single mother who had custody of her teenage son and was working toward a college degree in her spare time. Lieutenant Junior Grade Patterson had been born with a hearing impairment in one ear that he had overcome through exceptional focus and determination. Each of them, Lieutenant Commander Chen explained, has had to overcome assumptions about their suitability for this kind of work. They've all faced people who thought they didn't belong, who doubted their commitment or their capabilities.
and each of them has proven those doubts wrong through performance. Marcus listened to the descriptions, beginning to understand that the quiet confidence he had observed in the SEAL team wasn't just professional competence. It was the hard-earned assurance of people who had been tested not just by their enemies but by their own colleagues and had emerged stronger for the experience. That's why none of them rushed to defend me in the mess hall, she continued, returning to her seat. They knew I could handle myself, because they've seen me prove it over and over again in situations far more dangerous than a confrontation with an ignorant Marine. The word ignorant stung, but Marcus couldn't argue with its accuracy. His behavior had been based on assumptions rather than information, prejudice rather than assessment. He had judged her capabilities based on her appearance rather than her achievements, and the results had been catastrophic for his own credibility. So where does that leave us? Marcus asked, genuinely uncertain about what she expected from him going forward. Lieutenant Commander Chen smiled for the first time since he had met her, and the expression transformed her face completely. The stern military professional gave way to someone who looked genuinely pleased to be having this conversation. That depends entirely on you, she said. I can't change what happened in the mess hall, and I can't undo the damage to your reputation among your Marines. But I can offer you an opportunity to learn something that might make you a better leader going forward. She reached into a briefcase and pulled out a thick manual that Marcus recognized as Advanced Combat Tactics training materials, the kind typically reserved for special operations units. The cover bore classifications that indicated the information inside was not routinely shared with conventional forces. My team is conducting a 2-week advanced training rotation here at Camp Pendleton, she explained. We're testing new techniques for small unit leadership under extreme stress, psychological resilience training, and adaptive tactical thinking. I'm authorized to include a limited number of conventional forces personnel in the program. Marcus stared at the manual, understanding the significance of what she was offering. Access to SEAL-level training was something that most Marines could only dream about. The techniques and strategies developed by special operations units were closely guarded secrets that gave elite forces their operational advantages. Why would you want me in that program? He asked, still trying to process the unexpected offer. After everything that's happened? Because, Lieutenant Commander Chen replied, I think you're capable of learning from your mistakes in a way that will make you a better Marine and a better leader. Your service record shows someone who cares deeply about his people and who performs exceptionally well under pressure. Those are exactly the qualities we're looking for in candidates for advanced training. She leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. But I need to be clear about what this program involves. You won't be treated as a visiting dignitary or given special consideration because of your rank. You'll be expected to meet the same standards as everyone else, and those standards are significantly higher than what you're accustomed to in conventional units. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect. The training would be physically and mentally demanding beyond anything he had previously experienced. More importantly, it would require him to set aside his ego and approach learning with the kind of humility that had never been required of him before. There's one more thing, Lieutenant Commander Chen added. Part of the program involves psychological evaluation and counseling sessions designed to help participants identify and overcome mental barriers to peak performance. You would be expected to honestly examine your own biases and assumptions as part of the training process. The requirement for psychological evaluation felt more intimidating than any physical challenge she might have described. Marcus had built his identity around projecting strength and confidence, never showing vulnerability or admitting uncertainty. The idea of exposing his thoughts and fears to professional scrutiny was deeply uncomfortable. I need to think about this, he said, though part of him already knew what his answer would be. Of course, she replied, sliding a business card across the table. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. If you choose to participate, report to Building 117 at 0500 hours on Monday morning. Come prepared for 2 weeks that will challenge everything you think you know about leadership and combat effectiveness. As Marcus left the briefing room, his mind was racing with possibilities and concerns. The opportunity to train with Navy SEALs was unprecedented, but it would also expose him to scrutiny and challenges that might reveal weaknesses he preferred to keep hidden. More troubling was the realization that Lieutenant Commander Chen's offer represented a kind of professional forgiveness that he wasn't sure he deserved. That evening, as he sat in his quarters reviewing the training manual she had given him, Marcus began to understand that his encounter with the SEAL commander had been the beginning of a transformation he hadn't known he needed. The question now was whether he had the courage to see that transformation through to its conclusion. Marcus Rodriguez stood outside Building 117 at 0455 hours on Monday morning, his gear packed according to the specifications in Lieutenant Commander Chen's training manual. The past weekend had been spent in intense reflection and preparation, both physical and mental. He had made his decision after a long phone call with his father, a retired Marine who had helped him understand that true courage sometimes meant accepting help rather than trying to prove independence. The training facility was unlike anything Marcus had experienced during his Marine Corps career. Instead of the familiar rectangular buildings and parade grounds of Camp Pendleton, Building 117 was a high-tech complex designed specifically for special operations training. The interior contained simulation rooms, psychological testing facilities, and equipment that looked more like something from a science fiction movie than traditional military training aids.
Lieutenant Commander Chen was waiting in the main briefing room along with 6 other personnel Marcus didn't recognize.
3 were Navy SEALs from her team, but the others wore different uniforms representing various special operations units. The diversity of the group was striking, including 2 women, several men of different ethnicities, and individuals whose ages ranged from early 20s to what appeared to be mid-40s.
"Good morning, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Lieutenant Commander Chen said as he entered.
"Welcome to Advanced Leadership and Combat Psychology Training, Phase 1. You're joining a cohort of 7 other personnel from various special operations and conventional units." Marcus took his assigned seat, noting that his nameplate simply read M. Rodriguez without any rank designation. The subtle detail suggested that military hierarchy would be less important in this environment than individual performance and contribution. "Before we begin," Lieutenant Commander Chen continued, "I want each participant to understand that everything discussed in this facility is classified. The techniques, strategies, and personal information shared during the next 2 weeks will not leave this room. You will sign confidentiality agreements, and violation of those agreements will result in serious legal and professional consequences." The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering training objectives, performance standards, and the psychological evaluation process that would be integrated throughout the program. Marcus learned that he would be assessed not just on physical performance but on adaptability, emotional intelligence, decision-making under stress, and his ability to work effectively with team members from different backgrounds and specialties. The first practical exercise was designed to establish baseline capabilities across multiple domains. Marcus found himself in a room with sensors monitoring everything from his heart rate and breathing patterns to his facial expressions and vocal stress indicators. The scenario involved making tactical decisions while managing multiple information streams and communicating with team members who were dealing with their own complex challenges. Within 30 minutes, Marcus was completely overwhelmed. The multitasking requirements were beyond anything he had encountered in conventional training, and the psychological pressure of being constantly monitored added a layer of stress that made clear thinking nearly impossible. When the exercise concluded, he felt like he had failed spectacularly at every aspect of the challenge. "Interesting results," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the civilian psychologist who would be overseeing the mental performance aspects of the training. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, how would you assess your performance during that exercise?" "Terrible," Marcus replied honestly. "I couldn't keep track of all the information sources, my decision-making was slow and inconsistent, and I felt like I was failing my team members constantly." "And yet," Dr. Williams replied, consulting her tablet, "your stress responses remained within normal ranges, you never stopped trying to find solutions, and, when you did communicate with your teammates, your input was generally accurate and helpful. Most importantly, when you realized you were struggling, you asked for help rather than pretending everything was under control." Marcus looked at her in surprise. His subjective experience of the exercise had been one of complete failure, but her assessment suggested a more nuanced evaluation of his performance. The disconnect between his self-perception and professional assessment was something he had never encountered before. "This is why we conduct psychological evaluation alongside tactical training," Lieutenant Commander Chen explained. Most people's assessment of their own performance under stress is significantly skewed by emotional factors rather than objective measures. Learning to accurately assess your own capabilities and limitations is crucial for effective leadership in high-stakes situations. The first week of training was a systematic deconstruction of everything Marcus thought he knew about leadership, combat effectiveness, and personal strength. Each day brought new exercises that challenged not just his physical capabilities but his mental flexibility, emotional control, and willingness to accept feedback from teammates who outranked him, were younger than him, or came from backgrounds completely different from his own. The most difficult session came on Thursday, when Dr.
Williams conducted individual psychological interviews with each participant.
Marcus found himself in a comfortable office setting, facing questions about his childhood, his motivations for military service, and his deepest fears about failure and inadequacy. "Tell me about the incident in the mess hall," Dr. Williams said, her tone professional but not judgmental.
"Not what happened, but what you were feeling and thinking in the moments before you acted."
Marcus had been dreading this question for days, but he found that talking about it was less painful than he had anticipated. "I felt powerful," he admitted. "My squad was looking up to me, other Marines respected my reputation, and I saw someone I thought I could intimidate without consequences. It made me feel in control."
"And what did that sense of control give you?" she pressed gently.
"It validated my sense of identity," Marcus replied, surprised by his own honesty. "Since I was a kid growing up in a tough neighborhood, I've defined myself by being the person others are afraid to challenge. The military gave me a positive outlet for that, but it didn't change the fundamental need to feel dominant."
Dr.
Williams made notes on her pad, nodding encouragingly.
"How do you feel about that need now, after everything you've experienced in the past week?"
Marcus considered the question carefully. The training had exposed him to individuals whose competence was undeniable but who exercised authority through expertise rather than intimidation.
Lieutenant Commander Chen's quiet confidence was more impressive than any display of aggression he had ever witnessed.
"I think it's been holding me back," he said slowly. "I've been so focused on being respected through fear that I never learned how to earn respect through competence. And I've probably missed opportunities to learn from people I dismissed because they didn't fit my image of what a warrior should look like."
The second week of training focused on practical application of the psychological insights gained during the first week.
Marcus found himself working closely with team members he initially would have underestimated, learning to appreciate different leadership styles and communication approaches. A quiet Navy cryptologist named Sarah Kim taught him more about strategic thinking in 3 days than he had learned in years of conventional military education.
The culminating exercise was designed to test everything participants had learned about adaptive leadership under extreme stress.
Marcus was placed in command of a mixed unit including personnel from different services and specialties, tasked with completing a complex mission that required coordinating multiple simultaneous operations while managing limited resources and incomplete information. For the first time in his military career, Marcus found himself asking for input rather than giving orders, listening carefully to suggestions from team members regardless of their rank or background, and adapting his approach based on changing circumstances rather than sticking rigidly to predetermined plans. The mission was successful, but, more importantly, every member of his temporary unit expressed confidence in his leadership and indicated they would be willing to work with him again in similar situations.
"Outstanding performance," Lieutenant Commander Chen said during the final debrief.
"You demonstrated exactly the kind of growth we hope to see in advanced leadership candidates. Your ability to set aside ego and focus on mission accomplishment while maintaining team cohesion was exceptional."
Marcus felt a pride different from anything he had experienced before.
Instead of validation through dominance, he was being recognized for facilitating others' success and creating conditions where everyone could perform at their best. The satisfaction was deeper and more sustainable than any reputation built on intimidation. As the training program concluded, Marcus received his official evaluation reports and recommendations for future advanced training opportunities. But the most meaningful feedback came from Lieutenant Commander Chen during a private conversation on the final day. "I want you to know," she said, "that offering you this training opportunity wasn't about punishment or correction. I saw potential in you that you weren't seeing in yourself, and I wanted to give you tools to develop that potential constructively.
Why? Marcus asked. After how I treated you, you could have just filed a complaint and ended my career. Lieutenant Commander Chen smiled, and Marcus realized he had come to appreciate the warmth in her expression when she was pleased with someone's progress. Because punishing you wouldn't have made either of us better at our jobs. But helping you become a more effective leader serves the mission we both care about, developing warriors who can protect and serve their country with honor. 6 months later, Marcus Rodriguez was selected for promotion to gunnery sergeant and assignment as an instructor at the Marine Corps Leadership Development Program. His teaching style emphasized adaptability, respect for diverse perspectives, and the importance of earning authority through competence rather than commanding it through intimidation. He maintained correspondence with Lieutenant Commander Chen, who had become something of a mentor despite their different service branches. Her lessons about leadership, respect, and the importance of never underestimating others had fundamentally changed not just his approach to military service but his understanding of what it meant to be a true warrior. The incident in the mess hall had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its consequences had transformed Marcus's entire career trajectory. He had learned that genuine strength came not from never being challenged, but from how one responded to challenges with dignity and openness to growth. Years later, when Marcus was training young Marines who displayed the same arrogance and assumptions he had once carried, he would tell them about a small Navy SEAL commander who had taught him that the most dangerous opponents were often those who look least threatening, and that the most effective leaders were those who knew when to listen rather than speak, when to learn rather than teach, and when to show respect rather than demand it. The lesson had begun with a casual act of disrespect in a mess hall, but it had ended with a profound understanding of what military service truly meant, not the opportunity to dominate others, but the privilege to serve alongside the finest men and women America had to offer, regardless of their size, gender, or background. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had given him that gift, and Marcus Rodriguez would spend the rest of his career paying it forward to the next generation of warriors who needed to learn the same lessons about respect, humility, and the true meaning of strength.